Hamas strikes back with the only thing that they have, these little rockets that are about 1.5 feet taller than me and skinnier. Israel attacks with F-16s, with missiles, with gunboats shooting in there. Oh, and let's not forget this. Besides stealing the land, Gaza has been under siege by the Israelis for years. The place is a slum. It's one of the most populated places on earth. And nothing could come in and nothing could get out. And every time they kill a Palestinian, you know who these Palestinians are? They all have last names. They're Palestinian militants. They're all from the same family, the militant family. How about resistance fighters? What gives Israel this right other than the United States and the Congress and the Senate? And I'm sick and tired of saying U.S. supports Israel. I'm a member of U.S. I pay my taxes. I don't support this. I don't support murder, whether it's in my country or anybody else's. And this is murder in the first degree. Israel keeps stealing Palestinian land, and they're enslaving the people in Gaza. They're in violation of international law and UN resolutions. The only time when the United States or the rest of the crony allies out there scream about breaking UN resolutions and then pummeling the hell out of them like they did to Gaddafi is when it's in their best interest. But Israel could do no wrong. And as I said, save your letters, complaints, cancel your subscription to the Trends Journal if you're Jewish and don't like what I have to say. This is not an attack on the Jewish people, any more than my criticism of the United States is an attack on the American people. It's an attack on the leadership of psychopaths and sociopaths that are ruling both countries. So let's get this straight.
The world lining up like we saw before the first two world wars. Am I wrong in intellectually, historically, but also in my gut, feeling the serious tremors in the force?
I think there are only two major sources of threat. One is the British monarchy, and the other is the British monarchy's puppet, which is Obama. The situation is that, as the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States have shown, they understand that any war that breaks out now, such as in the Middle East or elsewhere, will be a thermonuclear war. There may be other minor things and conflicts which are going on, but any time the force comes in and someone says we're going to start the attack, it's going to be a full global attack, and it's going to be thermonuclear. And the question is, will anybody survive eventually, not merely out of the war, because if you get the Soviet or Russian and Chinese capabilities, which are very significant, and against the United States and Britain and something from France, which is the other side. And these forces are going to go against each other on a thermonuclear basis from the get-go. And that means that our submarines, our major submarines, are going to launch in their time. It's going to be a full launch, probably 1 or 2 rounds. Maybe within an hour and a half, it's all over. And the world looks pretty dead. So we're at a point where the idea of simple war, or war breaking out, or incidents leading to war, is not going to happen. What's happened is Russia and China have made a very firm commitment not to start a war, but to defend against it. Most people in the United States want no part of this. The only person but really behind it is the president, Obama. And Obama's with the Queen, but most of the people in Britain are not for this nonsense either. So we're on the verge of the worst kind of warfare one could imagine, which would break out very suddenly, with very little warning on any part. Certain services, such as the U.S. services, would understand and know this is going on immediately.
Let me stop you there, sir, because I mean, what you're saying is obviously right on target, but people may not understand the last two chairmen of the Joint Chiefs, the last three heads of CENTCOM, as you know, people can look this up, journalists can look this up, have refused to attack Iran, saying it would bring in China and Russia. Now they've sent the fleets over to menace China, and they think that that's going to allow this attack. But now even Dempsey, who's been known as not as smart as his predecessors, has been convinced and came out, as you know, last week and said, hey, I mean, the exact quote, was a headline was, do not blame us when Israel strikes and don't think we're supporting it. So that type, I mean, to have chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying that shows that the military establishment who love wars, I mean, you know, that's their, I mean, that's what they do. I mean, they love to be commanded off to war generally, are saying, do not do this. What, I mean, how significant is that? That signifies a mutiny within the saner sectors of the power structure.
I'm not sure the word mutiny is the right term. The point is, because nothing that the Joint Chiefs and others are doing to that effect is a violation of anything on their part.
Sure. I mean, that's the wrong term. It's a sanity call. What would you call it then?
The point is you've got to throw this president out of office. Even though he's just been nominated, I don't think it's going to stick. And he's not in a winning position right now.
But what does it mean inside the government, where you have so many connections, to have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs come out and say something countervailing what the president and certain sectors of Israel are pushing?
Yeah, but the Joint Chiefs are operating within their powers of government. And the president doesn't dare challenge that directly. Because the president is not a popular president. I mean,
am I right to say that it's seismic, though? I mean, how big of a deal is it to have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs come out, say that, and it gets almost no press?
You're talking about, if you're a member of the Joint Chiefs, and you're a patriot as I am, you're not going to play games and guessing games or anything with this policy. We know that any major war that breaks out on this planet will be a thermonuclear war. There are no minor wars possible. You cannot have a continuation of the war with the Middle East at all. Any such war will lead to thermonuclear war immediately. And that means that within about an hour and a half, most of the world is dead. And anyone who is competent, like the Joint Chiefs or other people of the same interests, have Russians or Chinese, all the same thing. This war must not occur. And if somebody tries to start it, we should get them out of the way quick. Because if we let this war happen, because we're in the age of thermonuclear warfare, and nobody can win thermonuclear warfare. The human race might go extinct within the aftermath of such an attack. So no sane person, and I wouldn't include this president as sane, no sane person wants to start such a war. There are other means we're going to have to use to deal with conflict. Many of the means are not conflict at all. They're just arguments about how we're going to settle things. But we've come to a time where we have to learn the truth. You cannot have war among major nations today. No sane head of government would launch it. But I think there are some people who are not so sane, including our current president.
Not satisfied with its missile shield in Europe, Washington has announced plans for a similar weapon system in Asia. A Pentagon official pointed at a perceived threat from North Korea as the main justification. But political activist and head of the New Patriotic Alliance, Renato Reyes, says that's a paper-thin excuse.
Clearly, the threat is being exaggerated by the United States. But we can see beyond the rhetoric that the real target here is China, and the U.S. wants to justify rebalancing most of its troops towards the Asian region. The so-called threats emanating from China are highly suspicious, questionable, and are in fact being twisted just so the U.S. can justify sending more troops and ships here in this region. Only intended to provide more justification for the permanent and expanded U.S. military presence in our region. That's another concern of ours. Will the U.S. missile shield would provoke an arms race in the region? Would it provoke countries like China and North Korea into taking a tougher stance, into competing with the United States and deploying more war machines throughout Asia? And if that happens, that would be a bigger threat to peace.
Who spent most of last year cheering on Islamist rebels in Syria, has now taken the line that Islamist rebels in Mali are the biggest dangers to the world and we must intervene, that Britain must help France, regardless of the consequences to Britain. And I think it's a very misguided policy. Unfortunately, the political elite in Britain seem to be all behind his policy, which is very disturbing. But I think the public, speaking for the public, I think we're very concerned about what's going on.
Okay, well, let's break down why it's going on. What's in this for the UK? What is London looking to gain from this support for France?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because if we think back to 2011, it was David Cameron and William Hague, people like this, who were the loudest and most aggressive cheerleaders for the deposing of Colonel Gaddafi, who was the biggest bulwark against al-Qaeda in Northern Africa. And now the very same people, Cameron and Hague, are the ones saying we've got to get involved in the Mali operation to put down al-Qaeda groups there. And so there's a real inconsistency here, a real hypocrisy. You know, why, if fighting al-Qaeda in Africa is that the biggest task, why did we play such an active role in toppling the one leader in Northern Africa who actually was a bulwark against al-Qaeda? And sort of what's in it for Britain? I think that what's happening, Anissa, is that this al-Qaeda threat is being used as a smokescreen for the recolonization of Northern Africa by NATO forces, by France, Britain and the US.
Do you think that's why we're seeing the ignoring of the rise of al-Qaeda per se in Syria?
Absolutely, because of course it's one of the biggest myths in international relations is that the Western powers are implacably opposed to al-Qaeda over the last 20, 30 years. They're not. What they will use the al-Qaeda threat in some circumstances to intervene and invade certain countries like Afghanistan, but elsewhere they will actually back al-Qaeda militants to actually topple secular regimes like the one in Syria and in Libya. And so it's got Frankenstein's monster, and of course it all dates back to Afghanistan in the 1980s. And al-Qaeda and radical Islamic groups were used by the West to help topple the Red Army from Afghanistan, to help sort of defeat the Red Army in Afghanistan. And that's all part of the policy, I think.
Now, you've mentioned that you think that this is all part of a bigger picture about the recolonization of Africa. How far do you think the British involvement will go in terms of Mali, as we're seeing so far?
Well, I fear we're going to be dragged more and more into it, because last week David Cameron was telling us that we just cannot allow Islamists to take power in Mali. And he can't sort of back down a few days later and say, well, it doesn't really matter if Islamists take power in Mali. So he sort of talked himself into a corner on this one by bigging up the situation there. So I very much fear, I mean, the neocons haven't got their war against Syria, their direct intervention against Syria. So now it seems as if we all sort of got to sort of support this intervention against Mali.
And it's interesting, they're kind of slowly moving from North Africa to West Africa, I think it's fair to say. Just briefly, Africa, of course, has untapped natural resources. There's no secret there. Which countries appear most interested, do you think, in securing those possible resources, expanding their interests? And do you think we could see any possible conflict of interest between Western countries?
Very possibly, because I think obviously France, from Monsieur Hollande's point of view, the economy is a very bad state in France, and I think he's hoping that a successful intervention in Mali will boost his popularity ratings back home. It's always been well documented, the uranium issue and how France needs uranium there, and Malawi is a big producer of uranium, so there are resources there. So I think France is very clear economic reasons, and I think economic reasons are behind every single Western intervention over the last 30 years. If we look back at Yugoslavia, the attack on Yugoslavia, the attacks on Syria, the Libyan war, all these were dressed up as humanitarian interventions, but they're not. They're economic interventions, and the West wants resources. The West wants to get control of resources in this region, and I think NATO is going to relocate to North Africa. I think that's clearly what this is all about. The al-Qaeda threat is being bigged up in order that when NATO leaves Afghanistan, it will relocate to North Africa.
According to the Associated Press, this year the U.S. military will be deploying an Army brigade, codenamed the Dagger Brigade, to Africa to operate in small teams in 35 countries. The brigade will be under the control of General Carter Ham, head of the U.S. African Command. The official pretext for this move is to, quote, train countries to battle extremists.